Picture it. The year is 1803. We are in Hammersmith, a small village just outside London. Winter has its icy grip on everything. A thick, soupy fog rolls in from the River Thames, swallowing the narrow lanes and crooked houses. You can barely see your hand in front of your face. Street lamps, where they exist at all, cast a weak, ghostly glow. This isn't the bustling London we know today. This is a place of shadows and secrets, where every creak of a floorboard and every rustle in the bushes sounds like something sinister. People hurried home before nightfall, bolting their doors tight against the cold and the dark. In this atmosphere of deep unease, a story began to spread. It was a terrifying tale, whispered over flickering candles in taverns and shared in hushed tones in kitchens. A ghost was haunting Hammersmith. Not just any ghost, but a tall, spectral figure draped in white. Some said it was the spirit of a man who had taken his own life and was buried in the consecrated ground of the local churchyard. His soul, they believed, could not rest. It was doomed to wander the lanes where he had lived, a tormented figure seeking something no one could understand. The story took root in the fertile soil of local superstition, growing with each telling. The ghost was not a passive observer. It was said to be aggressive, leaping out at unsuspecting travelers from behind hedgerows and gravestones. It would moan and groan, a truly terrible sound that chilled the blood. One pregnant woman was so frightened by an encounter that she reportedly died of shock a few days later. A wagoner's horses bolted in terror, throwing him from his seat and nearly killing him. Fear was a tangible thing in Hammersmith. It hung in the air, as thick and oppressive as the winter fog itself. The ghost was no longer just a story, it was a clear and present danger. This was a time before modern policing, before the world was brightly lit and explained by science. People believed in ghosts. They believed that the dead could return to walk among the living. The Hammersmith ghost story was not just a bit of fun, it was a community crisis. Men became afraid to walk the streets alone after dark. Women and children were kept indoors. The ghost had a grip on the village's imagination, and its reign of terror was only just beginning. Something, everyone agreed, had to be done. But how do you fight a phantom? How do you stop a spirit from the grave? The sightings grew more frequent, and the descriptions more elaborate. The ghost was seen gliding through St. Paul's churchyard, its white shroud trailing behind it. It was spotted near Black Lion Lane, a notorious spot for ambushes. Some witnesses claimed it had glowing eyes like hot coals burning in the darkness. Others swore it was unnaturally tall, a giant of a specter that towered over mortal men. Each new account added another layer of terror to the legend. The ghost became a shapeshifter in the public mind, sometimes appearing with horns, sometimes just as a formless white shape that drifted through the fog like a bad dream. The local community was trapped in a cycle of fear. Business at the Black Lion pub, a central hub of village life, dwindled as patrons became too scared to make the journey home after sunset. The parish officials were inundated with complaints and pleas for help. But what could they do? The tools of law and order were limited. The Bow Street runners were far away in London, and the local watchmen were little more than elderly men with lanterns and rattles. They were hardly equipped to deal with a supernatural menace that could apparently walk through walls and vanish into thin air. In response to the growing panic, the men of Hammersmith decided to take matters into their own hands. They formed armed patrols, groups of vigilantes determined to confront the ghost head-on. Night after night, they would set out with pistols, shotguns, and whatever other weapons they could find. They were ordinary men, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, and farmers, turned ghost hunters by necessity. They scoured the churchyard, patrolled the dark lanes, and lay in wait for their spectral foe. Their courage was admirable, but their quest was fraught with danger. In the fog-bound, trigger-happy village, the line between a ghost and a real person was becoming dangerously blurred. This armed response only heightened the tension. Now, not only did residents have to fear the ghost, but they also had to worry about encountering a nervous patrol with loaded guns. Every shadow could be the ghost. Every person walking late at night could be mistaken for it. The village was on a knife's edge. The very air seemed to crackle with anticipation and dread. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable confrontation, the moment when the living would finally meet the dead. They would not have to wait long. The stage was set for a tragedy, one born from fear, fog, and a terrible mistake. On the evening of January 3rd, 1804, a 29-year-old excise officer named Francis Smith joined one of these ghost hunting patrols. He was armed with a shotgun, ready to do his civic duty and put an end to the terror that had gripped his community. Smith was positioned near Black Lion Lane, a place known for ghostly activity. The night was dark, the moon hidden by clouds, and the familiar fog clung to the ground. He was on high alert, his senses sharpened by the cold and the stories he had heard. He was determined that if the ghost appeared, he would not be the one to run. As the night wore on, Smith waited patiently. The silence was broken only by the distant barking of a dog or the creak of a swinging sign. Then he heard footsteps approaching. He peered into the gloom and saw a figure coming towards him. It was dressed entirely in white. This was it. This had to be the ghost. It matched the descriptions perfectly. A tall white apparition moving silently through the night. Smith's heart pounded in his chest. All the stories, all the fear, all the panic of the past weeks culminated in this single terrifying moment. He was face to face with the Hammersmith ghost. Following the protocol of the vigilante patrols, Smith called out, "Who goes there?" he shouted, his voice tight with fear. "Speak, or I'll shoot." The figure did not respond. It just kept walking towards him. Smith called out again, more desperately this time. Still, there was no answer. In his mind, this confirmed his worst fears. A human would have spoken, would have identified themselves. Only a spirit would remain silent. Believing he and the entire village were in mortal danger, Francis Smith raised his shotgun, took aim at the white figure, and fired. The shot echoed through the quiet lanes of Hammersmith, a deafening crack that shattered the night's silence. The white figure cried out in pain and collapsed to the ground. It was not the ethereal wail of a ghost, but the very human scream of a man in agony. As Smith cautiously approached the fallen figure, the terrible truth began to dawn on him. The moonlight broke through the clouds for a moment, illuminating the scene. Lying on the cold, hard ground was not a spirit from the grave, but a man of flesh and blood, now bleeding to death from a gunshot wound. The man Francis Smith had shot was no ghost. He was Thomas Millwood, a 32-year-old bricklayer, and he had a perfectly good reason for being dressed in white. As a bricklayer or plasterer, his work clothes, his trousers, his apron, and even his jacket were perpetually covered in white dust and lime. He was, in fact, wearing his work uniform. On that tragic night, he was simply walking home from visiting his parents and sister, who lived on the other side of the village. He was a local man, going about his business, completely unaware of the danger he was in. The reason he hadn't answered Francis Smith's challenge was tragically simple. According to his family, who were devastated by the news, Thomas Millwood was partially deaf. He likely never even heard the warning shouted at him from the shadows. He was just a man walking home, perhaps lost in his own thoughts, when his life was abruptly and violently ended. His sister later testified that she had even warned him to wear a dark coat over his white clothes because of the ghost scare. He had laughed it off, confident that no one would mistake him for a ghost. It was a fatal miscalculation. The community was thrown into a state of shock and confusion. The ghost they had feared for weeks had been unmasked, not as a supernatural entity, but as one of their own. The relief that the ghost was not real was completely overshadowed by the horror of what had happened. An innocent man was dead. A vigilante, acting out of a sense of public duty, was now a killer. The shared terror that had united the village now gave way to shared grief and guilt. Francis Smith was immediately arrested, and the focus of the story shifted from a local ghost hunt to a national legal drama. The tragic irony was not lost on anyone. The very measures taken to protect the community had led to its greatest tragedy. The panic, fed by rumor and superstition, had created an environment where a man in white work clothes could be shot on sight. Thomas Millwood was a victim not just of Francis Smith's shotgun, but of the collective fear that had poisoned the village of Hammersmith. The ghost may not have been real, but its impact was deadly. The consequences of that night would ripple far beyond the foggy lanes where the shooting took place. The trial of Francis Smith began in January 1804 at the Old Bailey, which was London's central criminal court back then. It quickly became a media sensation. Newspapers all across the country reported every detail, and honestly, the public was just fascinated by this strange case. A ghost, a shooting, and a man standing trial for his life. Smith was charged with murder. The prosecution argued that he had intentionally and maliciously killed Thomas Millwood. They presented witnesses who testified about the shooting, and the court heard the heartbreaking testimony from Millwood's family. The case seemed, at first glance, pretty straightforward. One man had shot and killed another. However, Francis Smith's defense was anything but ordinary. His lawyer argued that Smith had not acted with malice. Instead, he had acted out of genuine fear, believing that the figure in white was the so-called Hammersmith ghost that had been terrifying the village. Smith's defense team brought forward a stream of witnesses, actually more than a dozen, who all testified about the ghost sightings and the widespread panic. They painted a vivid picture of a community under siege where, honestly, any reasonable person would have been terrified. Smith, they argued, was a hero, not a villain. He was just trying to protect his neighbors from what he thought was a real threat. The judge, Lord Chief Baron MacDonald, found himself in a really difficult position. The law, as it stood, was clear. Intending to shoot someone, even if you mistake their identity, is murder. The idea of shooting a ghost was, well, legally problematic. He instructed the jury that malice was not a necessary ingredient of murder. Even if Smith believed he was shooting a ghost, he had intended to cause serious harm. The fear of a ghost, the judge argued, was not a valid legal defense for killing a man. He seemed to lean pretty heavily towards a guilty verdict for murder. The jury, however, was clearly swayed by the public mood and by the evidence of the community's terror. They felt sympathy for Francis Smith. After deliberating for over an hour, they returned with a verdict that absolutely stunned the court. They found Smith guilty, but not of murder. Instead, they found him guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The judge was furious. He refused to accept the verdict, insisting that, based on the evidence, it had to be murder or nothing. He ordered the jury to reconsider, reminding them of their duty to the law, not to public opinion. Faced with the judge's stern instruction, the jury reluctantly went back to deliberate. When they returned, they delivered the verdict the law demanded, guilty of murder. Francis Smith, the man who had set out to be a community hero, was now a convicted murderer. The sentence for murder was automatic and absolute, death by hanging. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was passed. Smith was to be hanged and his body dissected, a common practice at the time intended to add a final indignity to the punishment. It was a brutal end to a story that had started with a simple ghost tale. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People were outraged. Petitions were organized, and letters flooded into the newspapers and government offices. The consensus was that while what Smith did was wrong, he was not a cold-blooded killer. He was a victim of circumstance, a man who had made a terrible error in judgment while in a state of genuine terror. The case became a national debate about law, fear, and intent. Was it right to execute a man who believed he was acting in the public good, however misguided his actions were? The public, for the most part, thought not. The pressure on the authorities was immense. The case had captured the nation's imagination, and the thought of hanging Francis Smith seemed unjust to many. Even the trial judge, Lord Chief Baron MacDonald, despite his strict interpretation of the law in court, seemed to have had a change of heart. He, along with other influential figures, wrote to the Crown to recommend mercy. They argued that the unique circumstances of the case, the widespread belief in the ghost, and Smith's intention to protect his community should be taken into account. The fate of Francis Smith now rested in the hands of the king. In the end, the campaign for clemency was successful. King George III granted Francis Smith a royal pardon. His death sentence was commuted. However, he did not walk free. He was instead sentenced to 1 year of hard labor. It was a compromise that acknowledged both the gravity of his crime and the unusual circumstances that led to it. Francis Smith served his sentence and faded into obscurity, but his case had left an indelible mark on the nation's legal and social fabric. The story of the Hammersmith ghost was far from over. Just as the legal drama surrounding Francis Smith was concluding, a new twist emerged in the tale. A man named John Graham, a local shoemaker, came forward with a startling confession. He claimed that he was responsible for many of the ghost sightings. It turned out that the ghost was not a supernatural being at all, but a prank. Graham admitted that he had been dressing up in a white sheet to frighten his apprentice, who had been scaring Graham's children with ghost stories. It was a simple case of tit for tat that had spiraled wildly out of control. Graham explained that he had taken some pleasure in the panic he caused, enjoying the power he held over the village. He would hide in the churchyard and leap out at passers-by, reveling in their screams. He was, by his own admission, the author of the community's fear. However, he insisted that he was not the ghost on the night of the shooting. On that fateful evening, he claimed he was at home. This meant that Thomas Millwood, the innocent bricklayer, had been killed because he coincidentally looked like Graham's ghostly prank costume. This confession should have solved the mystery once and for all. It provided a rational explanation for the ghostly phenomena. Here was the prankster admitting his guilt. The case should have been closed. But human belief is a stubborn thing. Not everyone was convinced. The confession seemed a little too convenient for some. Why had he waited until after the trial to come forward? Was he telling the truth, or was he perhaps trying to protect someone else? Or maybe he was just an attention seeker, inserting himself into a famous story. The public was divided. Many accepted Graham's confession and condemned him for his reckless and dangerous prank that had led to a man's death. But others clung to the idea of a real ghost. They pointed out that some of the sightings described a much taller, more terrifying figure than a shoemaker in a sheet. They argued that Graham was just one part of the story, and that a genuine supernatural presence had also been at work in Hammersmith. The ghost had become so ingrained in the local psyche that many were unwilling to let it go. Even after the trial and the confession, the story of the Hammersmith ghost refused to die. The legend had taken on a life of its own. It became a permanent part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale told to children, and a spooky story shared in pubs. The idea that a real ghost had haunted the village persisted, separate from the actions of the prankster John Graham. Some people claimed that the ghost sightings did not stop after Thomas Millwood's death. The spectral figure in white was still occasionally seen, flitting through the churchyard or gliding down Black Lion Lane. These later sightings cemented the ghost's place in local legend. Was it the original spirit of the suicide victim? Or was it now the ghost of poor Thomas Millwood, doomed to wander the place where he was so tragically killed, forever dressed in his white work clothes? The story became more complex, with layers of tragedy and mystery. The area around St. Paul's Church became known as a haunted place, a spot where the veil between the living and the dead was said to be thin. Even today, some locals will tell you to be wary when walking there at night. Over the centuries, the story has been embellished and retold countless times. It has appeared in books of ghost stories, on television shows, and on haunted history tours. the ghost has become one of London's most famous specters. The pub near the site of the shooting was eventually renamed the Swan, but for a long time, locals still referred to it by its older, more ominous associations. The tale serves as a powerful reminder of a time when the world felt darker, more mysterious, and full of things that could not be easily explained. The persistence of the legend shows us something important about human nature. We are drawn to mysteries, especially those that touch on the supernatural. Even when presented with a rational explanation, a prankster in a sheet, many people prefer the more exciting, more frightening possibility of a real ghost. The Hammersmith ghost lives on not just as a historical event, but as a cultural phenomenon. It is a story that continues to captivate and terrify, a whisper from the past that still echoes in the present day. The most significant legacy of the Hammersmith ghost case is not a spooky story, but a fundamental change in British law. The trial of Francis Smith highlighted a major flaw in the legal definition of murder. The judge's insistence that Smith's genuine belief he was shooting a ghost was no defense troubled many legal minds. It seemed unjust that a person acting under a profound, albeit mistaken belief could be treated the same as a malicious, cold-blooded killer. The case became a landmark, a pivotal moment in legal history. As a direct result of this case, the law was eventually changed. In the following decades, British law evolved to include the concept that a defendant's honest belief, even if unreasonable, could be a valid defense. The principle was established that if you genuinely believe you're acting in self-defense against a perceived threat, you may not be guilty of murder, even if that belief is wrong. This is a cornerstone of modern self-defense law. In a very real way, the ghost of Hammersmith helped to shape the justice system we have today. The story also serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria and mob mentality. The fear of the ghost created a toxic environment where reason was abandoned, and tragedy became inevitable. It shows how easily a community can be swept up in a panic, and how that panic can lead to terrible consequences. The vigilante patrols, formed with the best of intentions, ended up causing the very harm they sought to prevent. It is a timeless lesson about the importance of critical thinking and the danger of letting fear dictate our actions. So the next time you find yourself in Hammersmith, perhaps walking near the old churchyard on a foggy evening, remember this story. Remember Thomas Millwood, the innocent man in white, and Francis Smith, the terrified man with the gun. Remember the prankster, the judge, and the jury. The tale of the Hammersmith ghost is more than just a ghost story. It is a true story about fear, justice, and how a strange event in a small village over 200 years ago can cast a long shadow, one that reaches all the way to the present day. And perhaps, just to be safe, wear a dark coat.